So, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Good morning, everybody. Buenos días a todos. Buongiorno a tutti. Dear colleagues, members of the scientific community, I'm very pleased to open the first day of this two-day conference on inequality and social cohesion, which is placed under the high patronage of the French President, Mr. Emmanuel Macron. As you may know, or at least some of you know, in 2014 we had already a big international conference like this one. At this time it was devoted to energy. Then 2 years later we had another international conference in 2016 dedicated to the commons, which was very fruitful, I guess, as this one will be, I'm sure. And this year we have chosen to devote our international congress to inequality and social cohesion. Why did we make this choice? Let me just say a few words on this. Obviously, because evidence shows that inequality is a key topic for development. Inequalities hinder growth, most probably. They reduce the effectiveness of development policies. They also undermine the social fabric that is essential to ensure trust and solidarity within societies. And obviously, inequalities also fuel tensions, which are likely to degenerate into conflict, as most probably the French example is now showing. For us, at the French Development Agency, it's very important to understand better the link between inequality and social cohesion. Why? Because, as you may know, we have now two leading mottos, I would say, for our projects, the projects we try to implement in the Global South. One of them is 100% Paris Agreement, which means that we are trying to do as much as possible in the direction of having all our projects compatible with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in such a way that the global temperature at the end of this century will not increase by more than 2 degrees. And the second big challenge for us is 100 social link, which means that we are trying to do our work in such a way that all our projects, possibly in the coming years, will be compatible with the idea that we should regenerate the social link when it is broken and try to prevent, the fact that it might be broken in the coming years in a number of countries. In this perspective, for sure, understanding the links between inequalities and social link is a major topic for us. So as I said, inequalities, of course, I should mention this, are now a part of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the SDG number 10. As you know, the SDGs are understood by the United Nations as being a kind of chart of 17 SDGs which are linked together, so which build a system together, and which are relevant not just for the Global South, but also for Northern countries. So this raises, of course, a number of key questions. One of them being, is there a relationship between, let's say, SDG 10 and SDG 2? If yes, what kind of relationship? Can we just foster both at the same time, or are there some contradictions? If yes, which ones? How should we choose if there are some contradictions? And how do we deal with these SDGs both in the South and in the North? And are there some relationships between the two areas? Yet, as you know, inequalities are rising in the world. We are going to go in depth into this problem in the coming hours, today and tomorrow. Just one figure, more than 75% of the population, world population, live in a country where inequalities did increase in the last decades. As you know, also, there are a lot of debates to which I should briefly return in a minute on whether inequalities worldwide have increased or not. But nevertheless, it's clear that there are a number of continents where inequalities are rising again. Let me just mention Latin America. Between, let's say, 2000 and, let's say, 2012, inequalities have been reduced tremendously in a number of countries in Latin America. At the same time, these countries experienced a huge growth, GDP growth, which is a kind of proof by example that reducing inequalities does not prevent growth from increasing, quite on the contrary. But nowadays, as you know, inequalities are again rising even in Latin America. Another example, of course, is Asia, China, let's say. In the last 3 or 4 decades, China has succeeded in getting something like 600 or 700 million people out of the poverty trap. At the same time, wages have risen on the eastern coast of China because of the reorientation of the industrial production of China towards its domestic market. So in a sense, inequalities should have reduced in China. At the same time, they seem to have increased at least up to 2006. So it's a very complex picture that we try to get from China, and definitely we have to understand it better. And in Africa, last but not least, of course, a number of countries in West Africa have experienced a huge growth in the last decades, just let's say mention Senegal and Ivory Coast, but this was not accompanied by a reduction of inequalities, quite on the contrary. There are even countries now in Africa, for instance, South Africa, whose level of inequalities seems to be equal to the ones we observe, or we have observed in Latin America, which is in a sense new for us. So this means that definitely our topic is important for us today at the French Development Agency and for all the researchers who are dealing with this issue. And indeed, not surprisingly, actually, we received a lot of papers submitted for this Congress, more than 150, out of which we have selected 30 of them for reason of scarcity of space and time. So we are very grateful, and I want to thank heartfully all the submitters for these papers and to thank you for being here with us today. The papers we have selected try to reflect the diversity of the research devoted to inequalities. So we try to deal both with global as well as local issues. We try to focus both on regions and countries, and do this in all the continents, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Among the topics that will be discussed during these 2 days, let me just mention a few of them. Maybe the first one is the data. What are the relevant data we should use in order to try to understand and to assess the empirics of inequalities? As you know, there are a lot of data collected by Branko, who is here, but also by the Texas University with James Galbraith, who will join us in a few minutes, by Wider University in Denmark, etc. There are some debates, as you know, on whether we should focus on tax data, the data that are delivered by tax administrations, or on household surveys, or whether we should combine both. My viewpoint, but maybe this is not the general opinion in this room, my viewpoint is that we should combine these various sources of data and try to understand when and how they are consistent or not, and if they are not consistent, to understand why, instead of claiming that this source of data is just better than this one. Then, second problem, the issue of which metrics should we use. Once we have the data, once we hope they are reliable, how can we measure inequality? And as you know, there are various metrics that are conceivable, one of them being the old-fashioned traditional Gini coefficient. But even with the Gini coefficient, there are some questions. Should we use the relative Gini coefficient, as we usually do, or the absolute Gini coefficient? As you know, if we use the relative Gini coefficient, as was shown by Branko, inequalities worldwide have reduced among countries. But if we use now the absolute Gini coefficient, they seem to have increased. So which one, let's say, is the truth, with quotation marks? Given the fact that most probably the social perception of inequalities and social gap is much more sensitive to the absolute Gini coefficient than to the relative one. And then, of course, still on the methodological issue of the metrics, there is the question of should we prefer the Gini coefficient, which is a global measure, or let's say the tail statistics, which is related to the Shannon information entropy concept, or let's say a comparison between quantiles. Let's say how much did the top 1% of the population capture in terms of wealth in the last 2 decades. Again, my viewpoint is that we have plenty of metrics, and instead of engaging in a war saying this metric is better than this one, they complement each other, and we should try to build a narrative combining these various metrics. Then, of course, having done all this, there are, in addition to that, a number of very big questions, especially for us at the French Development Agency. What are the impacts of wealth distribution, social production, tax systems, women empowerment, and other proactive policies on inequalities that we could foster on the fields? What do we call with the concept of middle class? Does this make sense today? What do we know about social stratification and social mobility? So we had a very interesting meeting of the scientific committee of the French Development Agency devoted to migration. And of course, this raises the question as to whether there is a relationship between migration and inequalities. Another very important topic for us, given the emphasis that we have on climate, is there a relationship between inequalities and climate change? And all these, I guess, are very, very fascinating and exciting questions. I would just add one of them, which is rather theoretical, but I guess very important for us. Most of us as economists, we were trained in the idea, the old idea, going back at least to David Ricardo, that you can have a strong dichotomy between, on the one hand, efficiency, on the other hand, fairness. In other words, before trying to understand how to share the cake, we should at least have a cake. Okay? So we should do as if in such a way that we have some growth and we can produce some wealth to distribute. This, in a sense, this dichotomy is, in a sense, the foundation of the political debate in Western Europe. Let's say right-wing people are serious in making the cake as big as possible. Left-wing people are generous in redistributing the cake. The issue is that it seems to me what we are discovering today is that both are interlinked. You cannot deal with the first problem without dealing with the second. In other words, the way you share the cake has an impact on the way you can cook the cake. And in addition to that, of course, there is the issue of climate. If the way you cook the cake destroys the kitchen, what's the use of having a big cake? Okay? AFD, the French Development Agency, tries to contribute to this area with, I mean, humility, of course, but nevertheless, we were chosen by the European Commission to implement a research facility on inequalities, granted with 4 million euros. So we are very, very grateful to the European Union for that. This is an extensive research program which involves member states of the European Union and actors of development from the fields of academia, politics, and the civil society. Through this, what we try to do is to finance research studies conducted by research institutes in at least 20 developing and emerging countries. We hope that these studies will help them design appropriate public policies and reduce inequality harming social balance. Through this dynamic, what we try to do is to transform the French Development Agency into a platform of political dialogue with governments in the Global South, with the civil society, with firms, with corporates. Since a couple of years, we began to feed a political dialogue with a number of countries. We did this with the help of a macroeconomic model that was built in the French Development Agency called GEM. So we have partnership with a number of southern countries trying to implement this macroeconomic model in these countries. But it seems to me the issue of inequalities and all the questions around inequalities are an incentive for us to try to broaden the scope of this political dialogue with not just governments, but also with the civil society, with NGOs, for instance. So we definitely need to engage much more deeply in this kind of dialogue. That's at least my viewpoint. Lastly, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the partners who helped us organize this first day of the conference. So the European Commission, of course, but also our scientific partners, the Luxembourg Income Statistics Cross-National Data Center in Luxembourg, and the University of Cape Town, which are AFD long-term scientific partners. So thank you. I look forward to our fruitful discussions, and I'm very happy to welcome you. Thank you.
Good morning. So we are very much honored to have with us Janet Gornick and Branko Milanovic for this plenary session. And so first, let me thank both of you for being with us today and to share your tremendous knowledge on inequalities issues. So this session brings together two papers that were commissioned in our partnership with the Luxembourg Income Study Centers, the LIS, and they focus on middle-income countries. drawing from comparisons with high-income countries. And they signal that the inequality topic, which is very much discussed right now in high-income countries, is also relevant to middle-income countries. And you have, both of you have chosen to work on Latin America, so you will let us know why in a couple of minutes. But I guess it has very much to do with the fact that this is a region that experienced a reduction in inequalities in recent years. I wonder also if it's more also linked to a more practical issue, is that we have data on Latin America. And this is an opportunity for me to raise the fact that data availability is really crucial in analyzing inequalities. And this is why in our partnership with LIS, one of the objectives and the aim is to broaden the scope of data availability on middle and low income countries. And this should allow us to be able to make more analysis on countries like Côte d'Ivoire or Vietnam in a short period of time. So Janet's paper looks at the issue of women's earnings and their role in the evolution of inequality. And Branko's paper takes a more macro view and focus on the relationship between inequality levels on one hand and these redistribution policies on the other hand. So we are going to begin with Janet's presentation, and it will be directly followed by the one from Branko, and we will keep the question for the end of the session on both papers. So just a few words about Janet. So you are currently a professor of political science and sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. You served as director of LIS in Luxembourg, and later in the US office, and also as director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. Most of your research is comparative and relates to social welfare policies and their impact on gender disparities in the labor market and income inequality. You have published numerous articles in several journals, from the American Sociological Review to the Journal of European Social Policy. And you also co-authored 3 books on parenthood and employment, gender equalities, and on income inequalities in affluent countries. So Janet, you have the floor, and you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to even turn on the stopwatch here. Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Let me just find the button here. Okay. Thank you. You just asked a question I wasn't actually planning to discuss, and maybe leave it more for the questions, but why Latin America? In this analysis, which is very new, you're the first audience for these quite new numbers. I chose to look at 5 Latin American countries compared to 5 Anglophone countries, partly because I am interested in the region. I'm not a Latin Americanist. I attended a conference many years ago in Argentina about women's employment and have followed the aggregate patterns since then. There's been quite marked increase, and the patterns are interesting as we see convergence with the northern countries, but the main reason really was of data availability. So as we can talk about that, LIS now has 50 countries. I've been working with the LIS data for 30 years. For many years, it was just high-income countries, and we worked very hard to add middle-income countries, and partly through a partnership with the World Bank, our first large group of middle-income countries to come in were the Latin American data sets. They're also quite high-quality data sets. So we are filling in other regions. We'll come back to that. We're excited about the new addition of Côte d'Ivoire and Vietnam through our partnership with AFD. So in 10 years, I'll come back looking at a different group of countries, but for now, drawing mostly on the data availability and my own knowledge, I chose these. I worked for many years on gender disparities in the labor market and then shifted over working on income inequality across households. So I've been quite delighted in the last year to have the opportunity to come full circle and bring these 2 areas of research back together. There is a growing group of people looking at exactly this question, the contribution of women's earnings to household income. So I'm going to look a little bit more broadly than simply the contribution to inequality, but also look at women's earnings simply as part of the income package, how the two regions differ, and also look at women's earnings in particular, look a little bit at their transfers, and the extent to which they mitigate both inequality and poverty, and also affect the share of households that fall into the middle class. Okay, I'm going to raise three questions. I'm going to improvise a bit because I know time is tight here. The first version of this paper, which I wrote with two colleagues in New York, asks three questions. What share of the household income package is contributed by women's earnings, and also by the income transfers that are allocated to them as individuals? I'm sure many of you know a lot of income transfers are allocated only at the household level, but many are, in fact, things like unemployment and maternity and pensions are allocated individually. We specifically are looking at households headed by heterosexual couples because we're interested in the issue of male and female contributions to the household income package. Obviously, there are other household forms as well. Then we're going to ask the question, do women's earnings and their transfers increase or mitigate inter-household income inequality? That's a question that's received a lot of attention by both sociologists and economists in recent years. And then I'm going to ask, to what extent do women's earnings enable households to escape income poverty and also to be classified as middle class? The literature on women's employment in Latin America has been growing. I might just add that most of the studies on this topic of the interplay between women's earnings and household income have been mostly focused on the rich countries, and they've mostly been single country studies, many of them on the US, but there have also been studies on other countries in Europe and in Israel. There is also a large, exciting, growing literature on Latin America. It hasn't addressed this question until only recently, so we're sort of taking our first look at this in Latin America. Let's see, what else to say? Latin American women's, I'm not talking about trends, it's just a cross-section, but Latin American women's employment has risen quite sharply since 1990, and some important gaps remain. That literature is connected, of course, to the decreasing gap in gender gap in educational attainment in Latin America, and then is also obviously linked to the literatures on women's empowerment and on poverty mitigation. Women's employment has played a big role in mitigating extreme poverty in Latin America. Okay, just to say a couple of things because time is really quite tight. I'm going to say very little about the transfers, so you'll see them, but I'm mostly just going to skip that. We can come back to it in the questions. The data source is indeed lists. The Luxembourg Income Study Database, I think most of you know by now, a cross-national database containing repeated cross-sections of microdata collected at 3 to 5 year intervals, and now from approximately 50 high and middle-income countries, mostly upper middle. The data sets used in this study come from what we call Wave 8. That's our cross-section at 2010, 5 Latin American countries and 5 Anglophone countries. I chose those for the purpose of having this sort of research design of two groups of relatively homogeneous countries. I'm emphasizing the comparison between the two regions. These are the original surveys. They're in our paper. We can come back to that. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the microdata. LIST does all ex-post harmonization. We don't field any surveys. We persuade data providers to trust us with their really very precious and valuable microdata and harmonize it ex-post into a common template so that people can, the income concepts and labor market concepts are comparable across time and over countries, as comparable as possible. Okay, this study looking at households where both the household head, heterosexual household heads, are 25 to 59. There may also be other persons in the household, but we're focusing on the two heads of the household. The income variables, I'm going to look at individual level earnings from wages and self-employment, and also from transfers that can be allocated to individuals. That will be the numerator. For the denominator, we're going to use the classic disposable household income, which would be the earnings and the transfers to these two individuals, plus all other earnings in the household, all capital in the household, and all other transfers that can't be allocated individually. You'll see what that is. We subtract out direct taxes paid, and that brings us to the list definition that's also very widely used by many international organizations, especially in the north here, of disposable household income. Okay, I'm going to show you some labor market data. In the interest of time, I'll just say quickly, I've looked at in all of these countries the percentage of women who have positive earnings and also the percentage of women who report themselves to be employed using the ILO definition of employment. So let me come back to that. Those two indicators, they're likely to be relatively similar, but they can differ on a number of reasons, which I'll tell you what they are. And then just basically, all the numbers that I'm going to show you, we're adjusting for household size using what we call the square root equivalent scale, fairly common, especially in affluent countries, and all results are weighted at the person level. I'm going to show you some descriptives on inequality using the Gini that you've just heard of. I'm also going to show you results on household women's contribution to mitigating poverty at the 40, 50, and 60% of the median, the relative measures that we use, that many of us use. Sure, you all know, obviously, there are many other ways to measure poverty, including applying price levels and looking at absolute poverty rates, but I'm not going to do that here. And then finally, a literature that I've been engaged in quite a bit in recent years is the question of the middle class. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is its income share growing or shrinking? What do we mean by that? And how do women's earnings contribute to the attainment of middle class status? And you'll see a rather counterintuitive finding here. Okay, so quickly, I'm going to go through 5 sets of findings. What do the household income packages look like? What about the labor market incomes, which are going to help us explain why the 2 regions look quite different. And then I'm going to look again at just very quickly at, in a mechanical sense, pulling women's earnings in and out to look at what the role that they're playing in inequality across households, also in poverty and in middle class attainment, using only one threshold in each of those. Okay, this picture is a little bit complicated. I don't know how easily you can read it, but what we're doing here is we're looking at the pre-tax cash contribution of these male and female heads to the household income package. And here, the denominator is this disposable household income post-taxes and transfers. The Latin American countries are on the left here, and the first thing we see is that the male heads are contributing around 57 to 63% of the package. The transfer is a few percentage points more. And their female partners, the female heads, contributing substantially less, as little as 16 to 25% based on earnings, and another few points from their individualized transfers. When you look at the Anglophone cases, the 5 countries on the right, you see something somewhat different. The male heads are contributing 64 to 73%, and the female earnings 30 to 37. Now, clearly, in all 10 countries, men's contributions exceed women's, and the ratios of women's to men's contributions are systematically lower in Latin America. This particular comparison is complicated, perhaps, and somewhat counterintuitive, because the remainder of the income component shapes up quite differently in the 2 regions. In the 5 Latin American cases, mean income from all the other sources exceeds the taxes paid out, while the reverse is true in the Anglophone cases. That explains why, in this graph, in the Anglophone cases, both the men's and women's contributions are higher than in the Latin American cases. The sum of these 4 income components in the Anglophone cases exceeds the total household disposable income because we haven't yet netted out the taxes. So to make this a little bit simpler, I'm changing the denominator here, just another way to look at it, another lens, and now the denominator is simply the sum of these 4 components. The male head's earnings and individual transfers, and the same for her. And now we see something related but somewhat different. We can see that, again, male heads' cash contributions exceed those of their female partners everywhere, and we see larger gender differentials in the Latin American cases. On the other hand, with this restricted denominator, of course, the story shifts. Men's contributions in the Anglophone countries are lower, not higher. Men's contributions in the Anglophone countries are now lower, not higher than that of their male counterparts in Latin America. So when we use the zero-sum denominator, we unambiguously see larger gender disparities vis-a-vis cash contributions to the household in Latin America compared to these Anglophone countries. And here's one more cut at the same numbers, but now the households are conditioned on whether these female heads have any positive earnings at all. Okay, so we're really netting out variation across countries in the employment rates, and not surprisingly, that's the main driver of the differences between the 2 regions. It's the levels of engagement in paid work in the first place. So even a very cursory comparison, you can see quite quickly that when we restrict the sample to households where women have positive earnings, so again, we're netting out variation in the employment rates, women's economic contributions in the 2 sets of countries largely converge. So that's a really important story that helps us to separate the difference between employment and the earnings distribution. And here in both cases, women's earnings constitute about some 37 to 41 or 2% of the household, of the couple's combined earnings. Okay, so again, if the women are in paid work, the 2 regions actually look remarkably similar. Okay, so just to look behind those numbers a little bit about the labor market, let me just show you a few pictures here. Now we're going to try to distinguish between, again, the employment rates and also what's happening with the earnings. So here you see, not surprisingly, these are two different indicators, the percentage of men with positive earnings and the percentage of men who are coded as employed using the ILO definition, which is, of course, basically any employment during the current reference period. And what you see here is not a lot of variation across the countries, about 85% on both indicators in all countries. Ireland, in a particularly difficult economic moment, the men's employment rates were substantially less. Let me just pause to say, and actually I'm going to show you the women, but these two indicators, the percentage of people with positive earnings during the reference period versus the employment rate, it's actually quite an important comparison. It's important to look at them both, and especially in the Latin America region, as you'll see. What are the priors? Either of these numbers could be higher. One would generally assume, and is often the case in something that we have found in rich countries, is the first indicator, the percentage of people who have positive earnings, is usually higher because the reference period is longer. Could be a whole year or perhaps several months. So the percentage of women, obviously, who worked at some point, earned anything, say in the 12 prior months, would be higher than the percentage who are employed today. But we could find the reverse, though, and this you're going to see in a moment in the Latin American countries, because people who are employed may not have earnings, because in the ILO definition of employment, it includes unpaid family workers. And that doesn't mean domestic work, as I think most of you know. That means unpaid work in an enterprise, creating a product that will then be marketed. Okay, so that's why I look at both of them. And again, you can see fairly quickly, I won't read all of these numbers to you in the interest of time, but what we see here, obviously, is that both the levels of the frequency of positive earnings and the employment rates are substantially higher. In the Anglophone countries, the Peruvian case jumped out at me when I saw these numbers, where you see that the employment rate for women is 23 percentage points higher than the percentage of women with positive earnings. Of course, that led me to scratch my head, and me being involved with Liz for 30 years, my first concern, head of our data team this year, was, oh no, there's something wrong with the data. And in fact, the answer was quite clear, because another variable allowed us to disaggregate into, among the employed, into paid employment, self-employed, and these unpaid family workers. And as you can see, that is a very large category in Peru. About a third, 31% of Peruvian women who are employed are not bringing earnings into the household. Of course, they're contributing their labor. That's the point. So one has to remember that to be employed is not the same, of course, as it means to be an earner. And here also you see these quite important differences between the two regions. So the unpaid family workers are 0 to 1% in the Anglophone countries, the high-income countries, and as high as 31% in Peru. We also see a completely different pattern in terms of waged labor, which is over 90% of all the women workers in the Anglophone countries, a much higher share of self-employment in addition to the unpaid family workers. So once again, it's very common in gendered research, research on gender and employment, to look at either labor force participation or the employment to population ratio, as I'm doing. Those are really important indicators, but they're not perfect proxies for the probability of having positive market earnings. Okay, just a couple of things I'm going to move through fairly quickly. I have my eye on the clock here. I'm just going to show you 3 slides about inequality, and they're all telling slightly different parts of the story. We're starting to put these back together into a formal decomposition. But what you see here, these are, forget the green line for a moment, that's the household. The blue is inequality among, is wage inequality among men, and the yellow is wage inequality among women, and this includes the zero earners. And you see, especially in Latin America, a much greater dispersion in earnings. You see the same pattern in the northern countries, in the rich countries, but it's less pronounced. Now, when you remove the zeros and you're looking at wage dispersion, simply among those, these are annual earnings, among those across the regions, you see that the men's and women's patterns nearly converge. So, as I'm always reminding my colleagues in here, one really needs to pay attention when you look at all of these measures of inequality, whether the zeros are in or out. So because there's a much higher level of equality between men and women in earnings dispersion among those who have the positive earnings. Okay, in my last few minutes, I'm just going to walk you through an exercise that I did 3 times. I calculated disposable household income across these 10 countries, and then I calculated again, So, and then once calculated inequality, once the poverty rate, and once the share of households in the middle. And then I simply calculated it again, but mechanically removing all of the women's earnings, and a second time removing women's earnings and transfers. So again, it's just an accounting exercise. I'm not really removing anybody's earnings, obviously, but I'm not taking account of any behavioral or labor market effects. It's the same kind of exercise that we do at LIS. You see very commonly at OECD and Eurostat, CEDLAC and other places of a pre and post. So basically looking at two different earnings packages against the same threshold, okay? So this is the situation with inequality. The dark bar is inequality based on disposable household income, the numbers that we see all the time in the literature. The middle bar, the slightly lighter bar, is, that's the Gini coefficient. The slightly lighter bar is exactly the same, but when I manually remove the earnings of this female head, okay? I'm using that language of the head and the partner of the head. I'm calling them both heads. The head and spouse is the same idea. So what do you see here? You see that if you look in the Anglophone countries first, using this particular approach, there are many ways to ask this question, but if you use this particular approach, you do see that the women's earnings are quite markedly equalizing these Gini coefficients by 3 to 5 Gini points, which is quite a lot on the base. In the Latin American countries, for a variety of reasons, the mitigation of household inequality is marginal, and in fact almost none, using this measure. Okay, now doing the same exercise with poverty, this is what poverty at 50%, I could do extreme poverty at 20 or 30% or shift to an absolute threshold, but what we've done here is 50% of the country median, and here what you see is that it's the same exercise. So the darkest bar is poverty using the whole income package, and the second bar, slightly lighter, is removing women's earnings and then earnings and transfers. And here you see the poverty mitigating effect. In other words, a difference in height between the first two bars in both regions, but it's especially strong in the northern countries where women's earnings are a larger share. Now, the middle class, I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. There are many definitions of the middle class in the literature. The one that I've used here is classifying a household as middle class if its disposable earnings are between 50 and 150% of the household size adjusted median. There are many other ways to do this, the middle 60, the middle 40, or using these bands around the median. You can draw them in different places here. Now here you're going to find something rather interesting, and I think I'll just jump to my conclusion slide in a moment to explain this to you. What happens is when you take women's earnings out, the size of the middle class actually increases. And why is that? It has to do with the fact that more women are moving into the middle class from above than are moving out of the middle class. So it's, in this particular part of the distribution, it's actually disequalizing. It's a slightly counterintuitive. I'll repeat that in a moment in the conclusion. So I have 20 seconds. I'm just going to wrap up here. Okay. I'm leaving aside the transfers for now. They're fairly marginal. So just to back up and remind us all then, in the Anglophone countries, women's earnings are contributing about 30 to 37%, about a third of household disposable income. That's about 16 to 25%, substantially lower in the, my own fault, take 60 more seconds. Substantially lower in the Latin American countries. If you're looking at the combined earnings, women in the northern countries about a third, compared to about a fifth to a quarter in the Latin American countries. But once again, when women have earnings that are positive, then the contributions are almost the same in the two regions. So this is really a story about differential employment rates between the two regions. If you look at, just to step back and look at the employment picture, again, the employment rates are just evidently quite higher, despite strong increases in the Latin American countries, especially after 1990. There's still quite a sizable gap. The two regions almost never overlap. So the employment rates in the north from 58 to 77, in the Latin American countries 43 to 77, with that unusually high number in Peru, a third of whom have no earnings. The positive earnings, you see the same picture, substantially higher in the northern countries. And the percentage of those employed who are in paid employment and wage and salary employment is a completely different profile, 90 to 93% among the northern countries, as low as 34% in Peru and 80% in Chile. And then finally, just to recap what I showed you there, in the Anglophone countries, women's earnings affect inter-household inequality using that Gini story, reducing inequality by about 3 to 5 Gini points. In that framework, no effect in the Latin American countries, not yet. women's earnings in the North reducing 50% relative poverty by 5 to 8 points. Also important in poverty mitigation in the South, 2 to 3 points. Next, I'm going to look at a lower threshold extreme poverty, where I think the story's been stronger. And finally, in terms of bringing households or allowing them to maintain the middle position in the middle class, this ironic finding actually that if you frame it that way, women's earnings are reducing the size of the middle class. In the North, when you take women's earnings into account, 1 to 2 households move up out of the middle class for every one that moves in the Latin American countries. It's a different story. Still more are moving up. So in other words, the line between affluence and the middle class in many of these households is explained by women's earnings. So that's it for now. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Janet, to have been able to say so much in your great presentation in such a short time. So let's move directly to Branko. So Branko is a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center City University of New York and a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. You served as a lead economist in the World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years. And when you left, you wrote your seminal book on global income inequality, Worlds Apart. Your main area of work is income inequality in countries and globally. You have published in the Economic Journal and in the Review of Economics and Statistics, among others. Your last book, Global Inequality, won the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the best political book of 2016. And last but not least, you received the 2018 Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontier of economic knowledge. So Branko, we are eager to listen to you, and you have the floor also for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Of course, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Vincent, for the introduction. I would stick to my time, and actually we agreed that you would give me a sign 3 minutes before I'm supposed to finish. Now, the origin of this paper is actually, as Janet said, so I'm not going to explain that, is partly we actually wanted to show what we can do with sort of middle or middle-income countries data, because as you know, LIS has been founded and has really worked mostly with rich countries. Actually, for me, this was the first time that I've been using only Latin American countries, so it was actually a novelty for me. And what I decided to do, I actually decided to do something which I've done before, maybe 10 years ago, with rich countries, to look at the redistribution in a slightly different way, that I'll show that in a minute, and to apply more or less the same methodology to Latin America and to see what are the differences. I will skip that part which would be in the paper more than in the presentation, but actually the motivation comes from the original papers in the 1990s and early 2000s about the median voter. Now, that hypothesis, actually, you can read, I'm not going to read all the things that are, I hope you can actually read that, that are all said there. But let me show you that why the median voter was originally, very briefly, why it was misspecified. And just to remind you, the median voter is actually a hypothesis that was based on paper by Meltzer and Richard, and the idea is fairly simple but very powerful. If you have high inequality in factor incomes, which means in market incomes, then the decisive voter, who is the median voter, would be relatively poor, because it would be relatively to the left. The median, of course, is in the middle, but compared to the mean, the voter would be relatively poor. Such a relatively poor voter would tend to choose relatively high tax rate because he has to benefit more from social transfers than to paying taxes. And then when the voter selects high tax rate, then there will be high redistribution, there will be distortionary effect of taxes, and there will be lower growth rate. So this is actually a very simple model, relatively powerful model. The interesting part, and I will not expand on that, the interesting part is that here you actually have inequality having a negative impact on growth. But the mechanism is very similar of when you have original old-fashioned models where actually you have a positive relationship between inequality and growth. And it was also based on the fact that you actually have a taxation as a distortionary element that reduces growth. But you see here, because of the mechanism which go through a political decision making, you actually end up with the result that that high inequality in market income is something which is bad for growth. Now, I think it's actually a very important result. It's an important mechanism, but in the past it has been misspecified. And that's where we come to the microdata and the importance of LIS, and importance of SEDLAC, and importance of other units that actually have microdata. And the reason why it was misspecified, and this is the whole literature that was really wrong, so you can just read all these names, some of them quite famous. The reason was the following, is that they actually looked at redistribution was simply measured by total tax intake as a share of GDP, or generally a share of GDP. And the variable that was used for inequality was disposable income. Because these were the data which you generally find in tables. You don't have the data unless you have microdata. You don't have the data about inequality of market income. So these people really didn't think very much that they are actually studying a relationship on the result of that relationship. In other words, when people vote for the taxation in the model, they vote when they receive the money, and then they decide what will be the tax rate, and that tax rate actually reduces their income once they pay it. But they actually looked at already the outcome of the process, which is the Gini coefficient, generally speaking, Gini coefficient of disposable income. So it was a misspecified relationship, both in the terms of using overall tax intake and not real redistribution, and on the Gini side, on the rather inequality side, where it was disposable income rather than market income. In other words, when you get your salary, you don't decide what is your optimal tax rate on something which will be the outcome of that redistribution. So, but why did they do that? Simply because they didn't have microdata. It's only when you have microdata that you have data on inequality of market income, or the gross income, or disposable income, and then you can actually do the hypothesis more, you specify the hypothesis more correctly. Now, the result of that was that, as I said before, that the hypothesis was misspecified, the true relationship, I'm not going to explain these things, but you can believe me, the true relationship was biased. Actually, it was an exaggerated relationship compared to the real one. Then we come to an alternative, which is the redistribution hypothesis. Now, the letters are here very small, unfortunately. And here, actually, we say the following. We ask the following question. Are the states of the world where there is higher inequality of market income, are they associated with greater redistribution? So I will repeat that a few other times. In other words, if we observe one country, and that same country has higher inequality of factor or market income at one point in time, is this going to lead to a greater redistribution? So in other words, if you have relatively more poor people, are there going to be forces, as you will see in the case? Yes, forces that would actually try to compensate for that through redistribution. We can do that in two different ways. Now, one we can look is the higher market income Gini associated with greater redistribution, which is really anonymous. We simply look at the overall redistribution, and we look at a change in the Gini, and we look in the original Gini. But a much better way, which I will do in the paper, is to look at the share of the bottom, let's suppose 40%, as I have it in the paper, 40% of people according to market income. And then to observe how their share is changing when you go to gross income and disposable income. Now, let me give you the intuition. When you have people who are poor by market income, you actually will have this 40% could have relatively small share of market income, because by definition, they are the poorest 4 quintiles. So they will have something like 12% of total income, or 11 or whatever. And then as the process of redistribution unfolds, which means they receive transfers and pay relatively small amount in taxes, their share is going to go up. So the question that we ask, what would be what I call the share gain? So how much will the share of the poor increase in the process of redistribution? The important part is that these 40% of the poor are the same people. And you see, this is the difference between anonymous and non-anonymous. When we do it non-anonymously, we just look at the Gini coefficient of market income, Gini coefficient of disposable income. But there is lots of reshuffling, you know, because people's positions move. But when we have microdata, we say, well, these are the 40 guys. So there are like 40 individuals here. So they are the poor people according to market income. Let us see how much their position would improve through redistribution. And this is actually, as I said, what I've done before for the rich countries. There is a literature on that, so I will not, I will not go through all of that, and I want to repeat, I did this repeat in the case of Latin American countries. Let me tell you one more reason why this is in red, so you can just read that part, if you can read it. Why it is also important, because if there is a relationship such that if the share of the poor is the smaller share of the poor is correlated with the higher increase through redistribution, you can see that as a way how reactive is the system to an exogenous negative shock on the poor. So in other words, if suddenly this 40% of the people who are poor lose 10% of their income, is the redistribution going to compensate for that? Now, let me give you the intuition. And that would be actually an important one. If the redistribution is so strong that it compensates entirely, and you will see that in West European countries it comes close to that. I'll give you immediately now the number. The elasticity is 0.8 in Western European countries. In other words, if there is a shock of 10% for the poorest people, they would actually get back 8% more in the redistribution than previously. That could be through unemployment benefits, that could be from family assistance or social assistance. That elasticity in Latin America, just to give you the final result here, which quite a few slides in between exist, is about 0.2. So in other words, a negative shock to the poor in Latin America would be compensated only by the 20%. If you had the elasticity of 1, it would mean that whatever is the negative shock to the poor, to this 40% of actual people, it would be compensated to the full. Now, very few countries, actually nobody comes to the elasticity of 1. But rich countries come to a very close to 1, which means they really compensate almost the entire shock, 80% of the shock of the poor. And Latin America, of course, not surprisingly, compensates about 20%. So this is what I'm going to look, and I have to make here just one small definition, is because I don't want to have a market income inequality with lots of zeros when you have pensioners with incomes only from transfers becomes sort of somewhat misleading because you have the very high coefficients of inequality of market income. And everybody who is poor is basically a pensioner because they have all zero incomes. So I treat pensions, like some other people do as well, as deferred wages. So what I call here is a market 1 or market P income, where actually pension is treated as a wage, so that actually if you have a small pension, you're actually ranked as a positive income recipient. You're not zero immediately. That's a small, it's an important clarification, but I will not spend too much time on that. So essentially what happens, then let me give you the example of Mexico. You have here, I've got the 4 deciles. Now, from the blue, which is the poorest, then you have red, which is the second decile, and so forth. And then you have their shares in market income. And what you notice, then through the distribution, through gross and disposable income, their shares go up. So overall, the share starts with being 10.4% for the 4 of them, becomes 12%, and then at the end of the disposable income, when taxation is included as well, the share becomes 12.4. I will focus only on this part here because the data in Latin America, the data on transfers is better than the data on disposable income because many taxes are withdrawn at source. So in that sense, when I did that for Europe and for the rich countries, I used all 3 of them, and actually I focused on disposable. But in the case of Latin America, excuse me, I will focus on gross income. So now let's look at Latin American data. For First of all, do we know that Latin America is a country with very high market income inequality? Yes, we do. This is shown in this graph. I took Chile. This is from LIS data. Chile obviously has very high market income inequality compared that with other countries, US, UK, Germany. Very interesting case, Taiwan. I will not speak of Taiwan today, but it's a country with very low market income inequality and fairly low by any developed country standards inequality of capital income and labor income. So it stands apart. It's relatively close to Korea, but it really stands apart from actually all other rich countries. But this is a very sort of maybe, this has moved a little bit in the, maybe slightly confusing graph, but let me explain what it means. Here on the horizontal axis, you have Gini of market income, and then you have Gini reduction between market and disposable income on the vertical side. Now, these two, maybe something happened in the conversion, but these two circles should actually circle first. All the green area, all the green dots are Latin American countries. Now, let's look at the green dots first. What do they show? They show you very high level of market income inequality. Look at them. They're actually at 5. So it's a Gini of 50. What do they show you on the vertical axis? Very little redistribution. Reduction is about 5 Gini points. What are the blue dots? The blue dots are the rich countries of OECD, all the OECD rich countries. And what they show you there is that actually as you have higher market inequality, you have higher redistribution. And this is the point that I was mentioning before. The country, generally speaking, countries with higher market income inequality redistribute more. And that's what the blue actually dots show you. The interesting part is also the black dots. The black dots are Asian countries, including Taiwan and so on. But you notice there, you actually cannot read that, but the two black dots with Latin America is India. And I'm more and more convinced that India has features of Latin America. It's a very highly unequal country with very little redistribution. So really it can be, I think, for income purposes, actually practically reclassified. The red countries are formerly communist countries, transition countries, members now of OECD, and actually they see there is no really remarkable difference between them and the blue countries. So a different way to look at that, this is actually a cool graph, but I don't have time to explain it, but the cool graph says that essentially if you're at this line of 45 degrees, you actually don't have any redistribution. The Gini of market and disposable income are the same. The further you're away from that line, the more you distribute. And you see the country which is in Latin America very similar to European countries is Uruguay. So essentially you have in Latin America Uruguay, which stands apart even compared to Chile by being very similar in market income inequality and redistribution to the rich European countries. And then this is another cool graph for which I need time, is that here I singled out Mexico, US, and Germany. If you look at Germany, this is again Gini of market income and redistribution. The red line, which is straight line, is the line where you would have full compensation. In other words, if you lose on the market side, the redistribution is going to give you a full one-for-one compensation. As you notice for Germany, Germany has actually been around that line. Not fully, but close to that line. US has two interesting periods. So one period up to very recently, where actually US market inequality has gone up, because you see the horizontal line is going up, the distribution has not changed. And more recent, in the last 10 years, actually you have very strong slope for the US line, meaning that US is now redistributing almost to the extent that market income inequality goes up. Now look at Mexico. Market income inequality goes up and down, up and down. What does it happen with redistribution? Nothing. So in other words, there is a total sluggishness in the redistribution despite the fact that market income inequality goes up. And then the same, I will skip this because I don't have the time, but these are the same stories with the non-anonymous. Instead of Gini, I'm now using the share of the 4 deciles income. And you see the Germany, again, what I said before, it's very close. The red line would be one-for-one sort of compensation, but it is not. And then it is very close to that. And of course, when you look at compare, this is one graph that compares advanced countries to Latin America. You see basically all the dots are the surveys. And as you can see, we actually have more than 500 or 600 surveys for Latin America and for the advanced countries. And the very fact that that line is higher in the advanced countries means that there is a much greater redistribution for a given level of market income. The fact that that line is steeper in advanced countries means that that recompensation or compensation for each increase, for each decline of the share of the bottom 4 deciles is stronger. So then what do I do then? I introduce control variables and run regressions, and I will finish with that. The control variables are political variables. I will skip now the surveys that we use. Let me just show you the total number. It is 239 surveys from Latin America. Quite a few of them come from CEDLAC, and about 50 of them come from LIS. So there are lots of surveys, and they cover really a period of about 40 years. This is actually political data for Latin America, just to show you, for example, an interesting case of Chile. So this is the share gain of the poorest 40%. How much do they gain through the distribution? And simply here, we focus now on political side. We look at who was in sort of political power, whether it was center, left, or center during that period. So as you can see, actually, for example, left here shows a sort of positive association with increased share of the bottom 40%. But when this is Argentina, very interesting, actually right in this case shows a positive correlation, positive relationship with the rising share of the bottom 40%. Finally, the results of the regression. I will skip all of these things, and I want you to focus on actually 3 results. The first one is about democracy and political alignment. Neither democracy nor political alignment, left, center, right, have a sort of significant coefficient. GDP per capita has almost no power. The only thing which does have a power is what I was saying before, this number here, the share of the bottom 40%. The lower the share of the bottom 40%, the greater compensation through redistribution. So redistribution in Latin America works, but that number here, as you can see, is 0.13 or 0.16. So that's the elasticity. If you do the same graph for the rich countries, what is the elasticity? 0.74. So this is the big difference between Latin America and the advanced countries. And notice one more thing. Actually, in advanced countries, political alignment does not matter either. So here, this is something which needs to be explored further. This is based on 173 surveys from LIS, but political alignment does not matter. Democracy dummy gets dropped because all the countries are democratic, so there is no variability. It is done, with fixed effect regressions. And then basically, again, either GDP doesn't matter. But the redistribution, the conclusion, redistribution is a powerful mechanism in both countries, in both types of countries. It compensates the losers, but the compensation is significantly higher in the advanced countries compared to Latin America. So I think that I would stop. Well, let me see. I had one last slide. These are the conclusions that I already mentioned, and this is the last slide.
So Branko, Janet, thanks a lot for these 2 very interesting presentations. So we have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So there are some microphones. So the one, if you could raise your hand, introduce yourself, and please make your question as short as possible because of time constraints.
One is when you arrive between, let's say, 80 and 2000, and you have center-right governments. Now, in your regression, they don't come up
No, it could be actually, but I'm covering the period. I think actually our latest numbers from Latin America are 2013, I believe. We don't have anything after 2013, and they start in the 1970s. So that's the period, you know. So we don't have the most recent period. 16.
They are heterogeneous because the first period, basically there is very little redistribution. So if the 0.17 may be the average of one
True.
slope which is like that and one which is like that.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Maybe I should have split the sample into two. I'm not. Okay, it's a good point. I don't know exactly where to split it in what year, but I think it's a good point.
2002.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Hello, this is a question for Branko too. I mean, at a time where we are more and more obsessed by top incomes, what do you think would be the change or the way in which your result would be affected by that? I mean, you are using the surveys. We know in Latin America, we know that there is a rather substantial part of total income that is missing. And you may think that it doesn't matter too much because the share of the top incomes would be exactly the same in market income or in disposable income. I mean, you can say something like that, but I mean, how would you justify this? Isn't it the case that when capital income is increasing, which has been the case in most Latin American countries over the recent past, is it the case that redistribution, at least through the tax system, is changing and then you are missing something?
I really don't think that is a problem because you are, so long as you capture 40% income or 40% correctly, it is immaterial if that share is like 6 or 7 or 3, because it is really, you know, we are looking at a change in the share or the absolute incomes of these people, and really it's actually looking only at transfers. We are not including taxes. So I don't think that actually the change in the coverage of the top would have an impact, significant impact on what we see for the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, basically because you don't want to look at taxes.
Well, actually, the reason what I don't look, as I mentioned before, is because, I mean, I think it's possible to look at the taxes, but I think the lots of these taxes are withdrawn at source. So actually, I have net wage, so that's why I actually don't have taxes. But I think if you were to re-impute them, you could do that.
Hello, my question is to Janet. Could you please tell us some more about the factors that cause the difference between earning and share of women in the household income? I mean, is there anything in terms of discrimination? Is it due to mobility?
The difference between the two regions or the difference among the countries?
But women and men, especially in general, I mean, what causes the difference?
In general or in each of these?
In both cases.
Well, yes, that's an excellent question. I mean, oh, thank you. Well, let's see. In the rich countries, there's an enormous literature on this, and most of it has to do with the capacity to reconcile work and family. So I've done a lot of work myself across 25 rich countries, and women's employment rates are quite predicted by the generosity of certain kinds of paid leave, of working time regulations, and the availability of childcare. So a lot of the constraints are on the supply side. In terms of whether they're in or out of the labor market, then obviously once in, there are high levels of occupational segregation still in almost any of the rich countries. That's a combination of supply and demand. Interestingly enough, in the Latin American countries, some of these services are actually more generous, or they're in the law. They're more, the child care and leave is actually more prevalent in Latin America than in the United States. But the coverage is not so great because there's so much informal employment. So I think there are constraints on the supply side. The next thing that we're going to do is to look further in the composition of employment to figure out where they are in terms of occupation and industry. In the microdata, it's very difficult to figure out whether the constraints are on the supply side or demand side, but we can infer a lot of that from the composition of the kind of work that they're doing. I think the enormous difference, as I said, between the two regions is the prevalence of self-employment in the Latin American countries, and then in some cases, it's enormous prevalence of unpaid family labor. That just makes the story utterly and completely different from the northern countries.
Thank you. Matthias Crepier from AFD. So I have a question for Janet. Your presentation was very interesting, and I was wondering how you deal with the question of heterogeneity in the couple disruption, because you have different countries. Maybe in this country, couple can divorce or disrupt according in relationship with the share of women income or women position in labor market, and I don't know if you took into account this fact.
Just to make sure I heard you right, you're asking about the heterogeneity and the likelihood that women are coupled?
No, yes, because it may come out that women who have high income or high position in labor market has higher bargaining power, or so they can easily get free, or there is a relationship between couple and women situation in labor market.
Yes. Well, so I think there's a couple of questions, and this is really what you're seeing here is the very beginning of work. We've actually done some more empirical work, and some of it on exactly this question. First of all, just asking what share of women are coupled. And of course, these are cross sections, but what share of women are coupled in the two regions? It's actually substantially higher in the Latin American countries than in the northern countries. If they're not coupled, and these are working age people, in some of the data sets we know if they were previously coupled, oftentimes we don't. Something else that we've been looking at, which I believe is related to your question, I didn't present it today, but is the question of assortative mating. So we've looked at the correlation between his and her earnings, both in the cases with the zeros and without. In all 10 countries, both of those sets of numbers are positive. The correlation is even higher, of course, when the zeros are out. So we do see a certain amount of assortative mating, and that's true across all 10 countries, meaning that higher earning men and higher earning women tend to be coupling together. That relates to the question, I haven't done a formal decomposition here, but as to why the women's earnings are equalizing, and that's really because there's several factors. One is a certain extent of assortative mating. The other is basically the reality that women's earnings tend to be equalizing because they're pulling up the bottom more than they're pushing up the top. And that's true in these counterfactuals in the cross-section. It's also true over time. But the question about how people are coupling is enormously interesting, and we can do a fair amount of that. In the microdata, the great advantage of the list microdata, unlike, say, a labor force survey, is we can link people to their partners.
Thank you. We have just time for 2 additional questions. So if you can ask... Yes, thank you very much. Florent Bellecarat from AFD. In low-income countries, there is income data is scarcely collected, and it is not used to assess livelihoods. We use expense data because we usually consider that plural households having several activities and mostly informal, we cannot grasp correctly the incomes, and so does it explain that you cannot include low-income countries in this kind of analysis? And second, does it means that the lower-income countries might have an accuracy problem because informal activities are not very reliable. The data for incomes from informal activities is not reliable? Thank you.
You've asked an extremely interesting question. I'll just answer that in relation to list data. I think that's your question. So LIS has been in existence since 1983, and we've had a golden rule for all of those years that we would only take a data set if it had income data, and it has to have comprehensive income data that's disaggregated and high quality. We have discussed this literally for 20 years. Should we break this golden rule and take data sets in which well-being is captured by consumption, various measures of consumption? It would change our work dramatically. The downside is it would be more difficult to compare across countries, as you all know this very well, although many data sets combine inequality from income and consumption. On the other hand, the great advantage is we could add about 100 more countries to the list database. This year, this summer, we put the question in front of our board. This is kind of an internal issue. It happens to be the president of our board is here, Francois Bourguignon. We had a conversation this summer, and we've sort of asked the board, it's participatory governance, to give us the green light to begin to at least explore, to take consumption-only data sets. And our staff is taking a look at that. So it would dramatically change. And in fact, excuse me, I'm sure you know this, that's the reason that we don't have low-income countries, or even many lower middle-income countries in lists, is because of the absence of either any income data, or high-quality income data, or meaningful income data. The Latin American countries, as you know, that's also why they're overrepresented, have stayed with income data. And we have the first income survey from India. We have income data from South Africa, and now from China as well. But that will change the work that we do enormously. It'll probably take us a decade to implement the change. So thank you for that question.
Yes, hi, I'm Anne-Sophie Robillard from IRD. My question goes to Branko, although data issues are key to this issue. I work mainly on low-income databases. But my question goes to Branko because the results in Mexico surprised me. When Progresso was introduced in the late 90s, I would have expected to see something happening in the way redistribution worked towards the bottom 40%. So it's a question on Mexico, and just a more general question to whether your results have relate to the fact that the shares of social transfers in the GDP are very different from one country to another, are much lower, obviously in LAC countries than in Western countries, and how that relates to your results.
Actually, I was also surprised that I didn't have the time to look further into that. But I was also surprised by the absence of really movement in case of Mexico, and even in case of Brazil, with Bolsa Familia. Of course, the transfers are small. They are very pervasive, But when you take the bottom, I really don't know, this is guesswork, but when you take bottom 40%, they may be sufficiently small, they don't make much of a difference. But I'm not sure, but I have to say that I had the same impression that you did, that basically it should be more visible in the data, but it just was not.
I would just add, I imagine in the bottom 1 or 2 deciles, it would look quite different. I had the same thought. Then you may have some noise in the bottom decile, but I think with the cutoff point were lower, you would see those.
Well, so thanks again, Janet and Branko. So now we have a short coffee break, and then we have the parallel session that will begin, and you have all the information on the program. And the doors, it's written on the doors, the session that is taking place in the room. Okay, thank you.